Now, the technical term for what we are dealing here with is called selector precedence. And that is basically kind of something that you have to know or that you have to find somewhere in the documentation, which tells you how are we actually deciding what selector wins. And the good thing is that it's not actually arbitrary. It actually makes quite a lot of sense the way this is set up. So let's see if we can explore this a little bit deeper. We saw that setting those 800 pixels on the type selector actually didn't have any effect. Let's change this to 1000 and let's see that it still doesn't have any effect. So what happens if we remove the other ones? So to remove it, what I will do is I will go to right click and unset. Now you can see it disappears because we then also lost the height. So what we had previously on the red square was 100 times 100, right? Yes. Oh yeah, I know what's actually happening. Now, the reason this disappeared is that we don't have any other place where the height is actually set. Let's just go to the ID selector and also unset this. And now when we go to the visual element, we set a width of 1000. Let's now set a height of 100 pixels. And now you can see the element is back again. And that means that now the type selector is actually setting the size. So again, why is this now working? Because we only set the size on the type selector, the class selector, and the ID selector. They don't have competing sizes. They are not kind of overriding this, and that means that this size is just being used. Now, so this is the type selector. Now, when we now go to the class selector and we change the width to, let's say, 500, what happens? It seems that the class selector is winning with the type selector, right? It's overriding this this value that was set in the type selector. And now you might guess when we do the same thing with the ID selector and let's go back to 100. It wins again. Now, this, however, does not look like a square, right? So what is actually happening here? Why is this not a square? It's probably because of the margin. Yeah, I see. The problem is that again with this type selector, we are also selecting this this root element, and we are basically saying that this root element can only have 100 pixels. And when we then give it 50 pixels of margin, it's kind of shrinking down our actual element here. So in order to solve this, we should remove the height, and we should only focus on one of those properties. Now, please don't get confused by this here. The only thing that we are trying to do is we are now trying to set the width with different selectors on the same element. Because I did not want to kind of jump to the other to the next topic. We just are having this problem that this type selector is selecting two elements basically. So all of those sizes also apply to this root element, as you can see here. Okay, let's don't get distracted by this. Now, again, what we are actually talking about is what is the precedence of those things. And we saw the type selector loses to the class selector, and the class selector loses to the element selector. And that is exactly the intended behavior, and that is the rule that is actually built in here, for which the technical term is specificity, which is a terrible word for a not English native, but probably would also be difficult in other languages. Now it's specificity, and what that means is sort of how special is your selection? Like how small, you could also think about, is your selection? And what I mean by that is a type selector, as you can already see here with our problem that we are already getting 2 elements, it's a very broad selection. You are selecting all the elements with this type. So if we had 1,000 visual elements, we would select all those visual elements. So it's not a very specific kind of selector, because it's kind of a, let's say, a broad, a rough fishing net, right? Where you get a lot of stuff through. It's not filtering a lot of stuff out. Now the class selector is more specific than the type selector. Although obviously technically you can add this to a lot of elements, but you are kind of going more, you're kind of choosing more specifically. You are just choosing the elements that you added this class to. And obviously the element selector, not the element selector, but the ID selector, is the most specific one kind of by definition, because we said an ID should be unique. So basically there should be only one element that has this ID, although I think technically nothing prevents you to use the same name on several elements, use the same ID on several elements, although you should not do that. And one of the reasons is that you would expect that when you are trying to select those elements later, that only one element basically fits into this selection. So it has to be most specific, because it can, if it's just a name that is not there, it will not select any element. And in the normal case, it should select up to one element. So this is the most specific selector that you can have. And that's the reason why it basically wins. And if you think about it, this kind of makes a lot of sense, right? Because this is a way how you can kind of filter more and more precisely. Because if you would set something on a specific element, but then every kind of broader element would override this, you would never be able to kind of combine those things, right? Because the order how you would do that is to go from the broad to the specific, and you would say, I don't know, I have 10 buttons. I generally want those buttons to be blue, but there is one specific button that I want to be red. And that only works if you set the broad kind of blue color on your, for example, type selector. But then this one element, you have to be able to override the more broad selection with your specific selection. Now, I hope this makes some kind of sense. This is always a little bit of a tricky point if you have never worked with any CSS stuff also, and you touch this the first time. It's a little bit confusing in the beginning. Now let's just look at one more example where this maybe gets a little bit clearer. Let's for now remove this type selector, because we always have this stupid thing that it selects this root element as well. And let's instead copy this element twice. Now again, we should not call several elements by the same ID, because then it's not an ID anymore. So let's just bring in some variation here, and let's just append a number. Now we have 3 distinct IDs, and now we have to add our size back to the square to the class selector, because it's gone because it was on the type selector before. Let's give this some margin so we can see those elements clearly. And now we can see we have 3 elements with the same size, with a squared size of 100 times 100. And now let's say that we want to override one of those elements. So we have to get an ID selector. Let's say we want to override the second element. And because this is more specific, it only touches one of those elements. When we now change the width, it overrides the width from the class selector. And that is the only way that it makes sense that it works, right? If we made it the other way around, if the class selector would override the ID selector, then we would have no way to kind of provide this specific behavior. So I hope this makes some kind of sense. We will probably touch this somewhere in our projects or in the other stuff, in the other chapters, and hopefully this will be clearer. If it's not clear, try to set up some little experiment like here, some little setup, and play around with it. I think it will be once you do some trial and error, I think it will be clear pretty fast. Now to finish those simple selectors here, there is one more thing that I have to tell you, because otherwise I would not be telling you the whole truth. There is actually one more selector that you can use, and this is just this little star here. Now let's see what happens when we hover over the star. You can see everything on our canvas is selected. And that is actually what this thing is supposed to do. This star is called the wildcard selector. And that means you can basically use this when you want to select everything. Yeah, that's basically it. You might be confused now, when and how is that actually useful? And you will see that once we start combining those selectors and defining parent-child relationships and basically have several layers, then this thing kind of has a different use than when you only have one level like we have here. When you have one level, then it just selects everything, like ignoring what type, what name, what class it has. It just selects all of them. So while we're at it, we could use this for a small little quiz here by asking what would happen if I would set some size on the wildcard element? What would you expect? Now let's go to the width here. Let's set this to 200. And now does it change or does it not change? It does not change, obviously, because we said that the specificity is deciding which of those selectors wins. Now all three of those selectors have a size set, so they're all three competing against each other on this property, and the wildcard is kind of per definition exactly the opposite of the ID. The ID should only target a specific element. The wildcard will target all the elements of the level that it currently is. And in our case, this is targeting all the elements in our hierarchy. Now, if you really kind of want to be technical here, you can see that now this blue thing that changed did actually something. So actually this was a little bit wrong. Now let's just unset this again. When I unset this, you can see this blue container is bigger. When I set this back to 200, you can see now it only gets to the half width, sort of, and that is exactly this root element. And now why did this change? Because those other two selectors are not touching this root element. So the root element is only touched by the wildcard selector. And so here it doesn't compete, and that's why it works. But for the other elements where there was some competition for this property, there was no change because this is the least specific selector. Okay. I hope I didn't confuse you with that. It's always a little bit of a weird topic, because when you don't introduce those combined selectors, which will then be a different another thing of complexity, and so when you don't introduce them, you always have this thing that that kind of, it's not super clean because this root element is selected here. But I hope the point that I was trying to make here is just remember, when you have bigger UIs, you will start to have setting the same properties on different selectors, and then they may start to compete, and you just should remember the rule: the more specific, the more kind of power it has, and it basically wins over the least specific elements. And so that basically is it for this those selector types. And in the next lessons, we will look at combined selectors, and that is the last thing that we have to cover for our style sheet chapter. And then we will wrap up this section and move on.